good morning, or afternoon or evening. We're welcome to today's webinar. We are delighted to have you. I'm from the planning committee for the Forum for World Education, a fairly new group, 2 years old, that is focused on transforming education by bringing together business leaders with education leaders, policymakers, and researchers to really transform the current education systems that we have across the world to ensure that we are providing a high quality education for every child. And this, as we all know, is absolutely required if we are going to have a world economy that enables all countries to prosper and educate their children well. We've been having a series of webinars, and for the last 3, we've been focusing on alternative paths to careers. Some of those are looking at programs like Year Up that provide interim opportunities for students who have finished high school or are about to finish high school and spend a year learning about options. We've also looked at some international examples like Heads Held High in India, which is taking students from the most deprived backgrounds and providing them an opportunity to spend 6 months to develop the education they've been missing throughout their lives. In any case, what we're focused on today is how can we create some new pipelines? How can we ensure that we can move our students from secondary schools to post-secondary opportunities that will truly prepare them for careers of success in not just our country, though we're looking at our country today along with Singapore's Temasek Polytechnic, but also to consider in future webinars what the world is trying to do to ensure that all of its young people have an opportunity to develop their knowledge, skills, and habits of mind to be productive citizens and also to be productive in a work career. We're very pleased this morning to have with us a number of experts, and I have the honor of being today's moderator as well as the representative of FWE. And we're going to start this morning with I'll just do a very brief introduction of each of our presenters and then allow them to speak in order. But we're going to start with Bob Schwartz, who is well known in the United States and in many parts of the world for the work that he has done. He's not only been an academic at Harvard, where he's now working with the Kennedy School and a senior advisor to Harvard's Interfaculty Project on Workforce. But in the past, Bob has been an educator. He has started Achieve, which in this country has had a major impact on bringing together the business community along with education to look at what we need to do in order to improve the quality of education. He's been an advisor to the mayor of Boston as well as to the governor of Massachusetts and was the education director at the Pew Charitable Trusts before founding Achieve. We asked him to join us today because he has co-authored with Nancy Hoffman very influential report calling for more attention to career and technical education, pathways to prosperity, meeting the challenge of preparing young Americans for the 21st century. And not only did they write a book, but they created a network to put this idea into action. And I think that if you look at their 2017 book, you'll get a primer on what 5 cities across the country have been doing in not just cities, but in the case of Tennessee, states to implement those suggestions. Maria Cormier is a senior research associate from the Community College Research Center at Teachers College Columbia, where she conducts qualitative research on workforce development, developmental education reform, teaching and learning, and the student experience at community colleges. Cormier holds a PhD in education policy studies from the University of Wisconsin, and she has been working across the country with community colleges and has done a recent report on the future of work, which she's going to share with us today. Wallace Lim is the Director for Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Temasek Polytechnic Institute in Singapore, where he overlooks the Temasek Launchpad and Incubation programs, as well as other innovation and entrepreneurship related training for all of the students at Temasek. Dr. Lim is a chemical engineer by training, specializing in pharmaceuticals and nanomaterials, and got to Temasek to set up the Polytechnic Nanotechnology Research Facilities and the Temasek Polytechnic Institution Review Board for clinical studies. He's working on developing the nationwide strategic 2030 continuing education and training program and looking at manpower sizing. If you're not familiar with how connected and the government is with the educational institutions in Singapore, it is a lesson for us, I think, where the manpower studies really enable the colleges, the polytechnics, and the institutes of technical education to determine what the future workforce needs will be in Singapore. And our final speaker will be Ann Kress, who is the 6th president of Northern Virginia Community College, but she's got more than 25 years of experience in community colleges and higher education across the world. She's been department chair, associate vice president, provost, and president of community colleges in Florida, New York, and now Virginia. So she certainly brings a very strong background in exactly what we're talking about. How can we use community colleges in this country as the link for our young students to move to workforce success? And she's recently co-chaired the Virginia Community College System's new 6-year Opportunity 2027 Strategic Plan Task Force, which hopefully she'll say something about in today's talk. So what I'd like to do now is move to our beginning point here with Bob Schwartz and give him an opportunity to talk about the Pathways to Prosperity project and what he has seen in its implementation across the country. So Bob, the stage is all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. It's really a pleasure to be here with my colleagues on this panel. 2 years ago, Nancy Hoffman, I should say, so incidentally happens to be my wife. We've both written together and worked together. We contributed to a book called Vocational Education and Training for a Global Economy. And it was a case study of 3 national systems in the US, which really doesn't have a national vocational system. And the 4 countries we picked were an interesting mix because we picked Switzerland and Singapore because I think arguably, at least I would say those are the 2 strongest systems that I've seen internationally. Singapore is the best example I know of a mostly school-based vocational system. Switzerland, the best example of a mostly work-based system. And the reason for including the US and China was that, these are the 2 largest economies. And the interesting question was, what's the relationship between a strong vocational system and a national economic development strategy? And in Singapore and Switzerland, these systems are really at the heart of a sort of national economic strategy, and they are not in either the US or China. No one's ever accused the US of having, in international terms, at least a really strong vocational system. In fact, a decade ago, when the OECD put out a report called Learning for Jobs, in the draft report, they had a chart showing the relative proportion of young people who are in either the sort of school-based or work-based vocational education system. In the US, in the final report, was left off the chart because in the draft report, it showed the US as having about 1% of its students in either of these kinds of systems. And the US policy people who looked at it screamed and shouted and said, no, we have 20% of our students are CTE concentrators and 75% take at least one course. And the international people just kind of laughed and said, well, in our terms, that dosage is so weak and so small relative to what other systems do that it just doesn't count. So point number one, 40 years ago, at least in the US, two-thirds of jobs required only a high school education. So, whether in that sense, in that era, we basically formally or informally divided high school populations into, the college bound and then the work bound. And whether the work bound got vocational education or not, in some sense, it mattered relatively less because with a high school diploma, you could still move into a good job, especially in the manufacturing sector or in one of the traditional trades, probably through an apprenticeship kind of model, or even in the financial services. And with a high school diploma, you could get started. Obviously, in today's economy, simply no longer the case. We've now kind of reversed things. At least two-thirds of jobs in the US economy require something beyond a high school education, some kind of a credential that certifies a set of skills beyond what we expect high school students to do. And even though we still have a significant chunk of jobs that are going to people with only a high school diploma, they are mostly low skill, low wage jobs, hard jobs to move up with into the kind of middle class wage and lifestyle that their parents used to be able to do without anything more than a high school diploma. One of the interesting things that Susan referenced Achieve, an organization that I led for a while, and that was right in the middle of this movement that began in the 1990s in the US to really focus on kind of raising academic standards and raising academic performance in the schools. And young people and their parents kind of got the message that somehow what this really meant was that, and high schools got the message, everybody needed to be prepared for, quote, college. For most US people, if you say college, they immediately think of a four-year institution, whether or not it's a college, which in international terms, these terms mean something different. But basically, colleges in the U.S. are schools that primarily serve undergraduate students. Universities have both graduate school programs as well as undergraduate ones. But in any event, 90% of high school kids in the early 90s, if you ask them, what are you going to do after high school? I'm going on to to some kind of college. 70% in fact enrolled, but if you ask the following October after high school, after they left high school. But if you ask the hard question by age 25, what proportion of students in fact had attained a four-year degree? And Susan, if you could put up my one slide that I've brought for this session, you'll understand why I picked this one slide. Basically, this is a slide that looks at all people born in the 1970s and the 1980s. So we're looking at a 20-year period. It uses family wealth as the key indicator here and divides this whole population into three groups. The high wealth group, top 20%, they're on the sort of right side as you're looking at the slide. Middle group is the middle 40%. And on the left-hand side is the bottom 40%. And what's really, if you look at the middle group, for example, this is the national, roughly one young person in three by age 25 gets a four-year degree. But if you look at the left-hand slide, what's really striking, the dotted line is attended, have some college. And as you can see, those lines are going up over this 20 period. That's the good news. Roughly 50% of people from this bottom 40% of the family wealth group have some college. But the really striking finding and disheartening finding is if you look at graduation rates over this 20-year period, again, for the lowest 40% of students, again, divided by family wealth, it was 11.3% for those born in the 1970s and only 11.8% for those born in the 1980s. And again, this is question is who has attained a four-year degree? Without trying to explain or disaggregate this. And by the way, this, as you might guess, family wealth correlates highly with race in the US. And what this says to me, at least, is if we're waiting around for our four-year institutions, our colleges and universities, to solve the problem of kind of stalled economic mobility, if we're counting on our four-year institutions to provide, get young people launched, on a path to, of upward social and economic mobility, it's going to be a very, very long wait, which is one of the reasons why I and my colleagues focus so intensely on community colleges. These are two-year institutions in the US. They are open access institutions. They're multi-purpose. They serve a range of different kinds of learners, adults as well as young people, coming with very different kind of goals. But if we are going to have a national strategy, I would argue, to really address this issue of economic mobility for those furthest behind, I think the public institution that we have that's really has to become absolutely central to this strategy is the community college. And we can take that slide down now, Susan. Susan alluded to the Pathways to Prosperity network, and I'll just say a few things about that before closing. That network was kind of organized around this kind of these findings. Basically, what we're trying to do is help the states and regions and cities that we work with build what we call career pathways system that span both high school and community college, ideally in a kind of seamless way, with the goal being to equip students with skills and credentials that are necessary to attain a first post-secondary credential that has value in the labor market. That could be, a set of industry certifications. It could be, a one-year certificate, but ideally, it's a two-year degree, associate's degree from a community college, but one that is aligned with regional labor market needs. And that's what our big focus has been. We take the position, and this gets to one of the organizing questions for this meeting. We take the position that all young people in today's world need to be prepared both for college, and in this sense, we're using the word college to mean some kind of post-secondary education or training beyond high school, both college and career. And we say that's universal. This is not, some people need to be prepared to go off to a university, and others need to be prepared for work. Everybody needs to have much more exposure to the world of work and careers if they're going to make an informed choice about what they do on leaving high school. And we argue all young people should have an opportunity to get started on college while still in high school. This may sound counterintuitive to people outside the US, but we have a strong database now of evidence saying that particularly for young people who don't come from college-going families or backgrounds, this is really the best predictor of college going and ultimately of college success. I'm just going to mention a couple of that. We're 10 years in, a couple of major findings, if you will. First, community colleges we see as the absolutely central institution. They sit between the high schools on the one side and employers on the other. Second, we believe that this work needs to begin by mapping backwards, not starting with high schools, but actually starting with employers, building connections between what's regional demand look like, building partnerships between employers and community colleges, and then connecting young people from high schools in this kind of seamless way, getting them started on the college work on a career pathway while still in high school. Just last point really around what are the big challenges, and I think can speak better to this than I can. But one is that we have different funding systems, governance systems, and political constituencies for our high schools and for community colleges. So that is really a challenge in the US. Second, the community colleges have these multiple purpose institutions, and how do we really help them focus much more on their workforce mission? And finally, how do we help employers understand and learn to see community colleges as a major source of a kind of a talent pipeline for their region? And unless we can really move our system to a system that's much more demand driven than supply driven, we're just not going to make the kind of progress that we'd like to make. So that's mine.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
And Maria, what are you finding in the future of work? The community college system?
Yes, first off, I want to thank Bob because I feel like you just set up my presentation so nicely. And so I thank you. And you know, as coming from the Community College Research Center, it's always just heartening to hear others who are passionate and committed to the role of community colleges in the United States. So thank you, Bob. Give me 1 second though to set up. I have a few more slides than Bob, so please bear with me, indulge me here. As a researcher, we can't go anywhere without slides. So just a second while I get that going. Okay, can you all see this or not yet? I need to share my screen. You could see it?
Nope, not yet.
Oh, okay, my apologies. Here we go. All right, how about now?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, and you can still see it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Great. Okay, so as Susan said, my name is Maria Cormier. I'm from the Community College Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University. CCRC, as it's known more fondly, oversees a multi kind of faceted range of research looking at the role of community colleges in the United States. We look at that high school to college transition. We look at other access points. We look at completion and institutional change within community colleges, and the types of supports and services students need, the role of faculty and administrators, and the sort of research that I oversee there is related to workforce development and occupational training. And we recently completed a project, as Susan alluded to, in partnership with MIT, that set out to understand how community colleges are adapting their workforce training programs to meet the kind of the changes that are happening in the workplace due to technological advances. And so we conducted this study in partnership with 8 colleges across the country. And we tried to capture geographical diversity, regional labor market diversity, student diversity, and also community diversity. And so equity was really kind of an underlying goal of the project, to understand not only what are the changes that are happening, but in what way are those impacting students and students' access to kind of entry-level, mid-level jobs that provide family supporting wages. And so today I'm going to kind of focus on a few key findings related to the skill demands and the ways in which colleges described those changing skill demands and some of the adjustments they were making in response. Okay. So, you know, as Bob suggested, community colleges have long kind of been a central part of workforce training in the US. It's often been a very siloed part and distinct from what some refer to as sort of the academic side of the house. And, you know, in their role in providing workforce training, they've always focused on the academic and technical skills that are needed to succeed in the workplace. And this has always been the core of community college workforce training programs. Through our work, though, in this study, what became clear, though, is that some of the skill focus has started to shift more towards the professional skills. So some people refer to these as 21st century skills, soft skills, and there's been an increasing emphasis on those skills, as well as what I think many now refer to as digital and data literacy. And what these kind of this combination of skill demands is leading to is a demand for employees to act as adaptable generalists. And what that means is that employers are looking for students to enter the workplace and be able to adapt and change and modulate their skills based on the workplace, in part because technological changes are happening so rapidly. And so no longer are community college workforce training programs expected to just really hone in on one skill, right? Like the tool and die, or, you know, if you're preparing to go to an auto plant, you know, employers are now seeking students and employees that really kind of have a combination of those 4 skills, right? It's beyond just that one specific set of technical skills. And they really want students to be able to enter the workplace and adapt and be able to kind of change it as the technology changes in the workplace. And as I sort of suggested, there's also now this increased emphasis on digital skills that we didn't necessarily see 5-10 years ago. And this has now become kind of, I think, common to hear about data literacy, digital literacy, being able to not only understand the technological changes, but use the technology in the workplace. We heard at one college how the work of the engineer is now the work of the entry-level person, right? So if you're on a shop floor, you're now expected to actually do the work, use the technology, and understand the digital skills that an engineer maybe had to do 5-10 years ago. And that's a really significant shift when thinking about the different types of jobs that are in many of these workplaces. And one of the implications of that, though, is thinking about how colleges are teaching math and what the focus of math skills typically are and traditionally have been in community colleges. And it often has been based on this traditional higher order math skills that typically lead to algebra or a STEM pathway. And what we heard over and over is that actually employees are asking for students who can have a better understanding of measurement and data and manipulation and analyze the data and how do they use the data, right? So for example, if you have a building automation system degree program, right, that person has to be able to understand now the technology, right? It's no longer just the typical air conditioning maintenance repairman coming in and fixing the big machine outside the house. There's a whole automated system behind that an employee has to understand. And they have to be able to interpret that data that's coming in. And they have to be able to then communicate that data, right? And that's, again, a shift, I think, in what it was expected, again, in those entry-level positions. And so this has implications for colleges and how they think about the way in which they're teaching math. Because for those who aren't familiar, math continues to be a significant barrier for many students in America's community colleges. And I think Anne can probably speak to that, and Bob as well, in your experience over the years. And then a third point that became very clear to us, and Bob, you touched on this, is that changes in the workplace are necessitating colleges to broaden student access to work-based learning opportunities. For those who don't know this, CCRC actually started, the first grant at CCRC was based on apprenticeships, to study apprenticeships and internships in the United States. And, back then, those types of work-based learning experiences were very isolated and distinct to specific occupations. And what we're hearing now, though, is that across occupations, across industries, students must have work-based learning in order to enter into the workplace successfully. And so it's no longer just defined to, someone going into manufacturing, having that, 2-month period where they're getting onboarded and learning about the equipment. It really now, because changes are happening in the workplace so quickly and students need to be able to get in there and understand what's going on, but it's an opportunity for them to acquire the professional skills and to get exposure to the professional environment. And, I think, Bob, your point that in the US, we just don't do this. We don't do it at scale, and we don't do it equitably. You always hear about in the United States, those coveted Wall Street internships, right? That students from the elite 4-year institutions get. And, we don't provide those same internship opportunities, whether it's on Wall Street or even, the technology companies in the Bay Area, to our community college students in the same way. And this is something we heard very consistently across all 8 colleges. And these are colleges in New York City, upstate New York, the Bay Area, Dallas, Raleigh, Florida, that community college students face a number of barriers to getting access to quality paid work-based learning opportunities. And then finally, I just want to touch on the equity piece of all of this. As skill demands change and expectations of entry and technician level workers become more complex, it is imperative that community colleges think about what the implications are for equity. And in particular, students' access and success in these high value workforce programs, which tend to have selective admissions criteria, again, where math tends to be a really tremendous barrier to many students' access and success in these programs. And so I think that's one area that community colleges still struggle with, is thinking about how do we define and operationalize equity? What does it actually mean to say we are committed to creating more equitable programs and access and completion in these programs? What are the types of institutional changes that actually need to happen? And that was one thing that we heard again and again from colleges, that they're committed to equity, but they're not quite sure what that means on the ground and how to do it.
Well, that is great. Thank you so much. And I know that The Algebra 1 requirement or college algebra requirement at community colleges has definitely been a challenge for many, many of our students. So thank you, Maria, for that. And we'll move on to Wallace Lim from Temasek Polytechnic.
Thank you, Susan. And greetings, friends and colleagues. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share our experience in innovation and entrepreneurship training, more on a micro level in Temasek Polytechnic. So could I request for the slides to be up?
David, we need our slides. Ah, dear. That didn't work. David, are you there? Can you put up the slides? Do you want us to try showing them from your screen?
I'll try.
Ah, there. Okay.
Thank you so much. The next slide, please. So with Industry 4.0, many jobs will progressively become obsolete. And what replaces this will be a new suite of jobs that requires fundamentally, as what Maria said, a higher level of skill sets. Employers are recruiting and working with people that possess crucial horizontal skills that complements their individual technical know-hows. There is an increasing emphasis on horizontals such as innovative thinking and active learning. So in Temasek Poly, we have also identified a suite of critical core skills and have categorized them into 3 profiles. For every student that steps through the doors of Temasek Polytechnic, we endeavor to make him and her a lifelong learner, a future-oriented creator, and a value-centered leader. Next slide, please. So please allow me to share how Temasek Poly has embarked on this journey with our students, with the aim of to develop in them an innovative mindset and an entrepreneurial spirit. When we talk about entrepreneurial, what Temasek Poly focused on is the ability to see opportunities in adversity, to be bold and take calculated risks. And most importantly, when some risks inevitably do not pan out, the ability to embrace mistakes and use them as platforms to spring forward. These traits will certainly serve our views well, regardless whether they are employees or their own employers in the future. To achieve this, we have created a 3-tier approach. All students that enter Temasek Poly will undergo a discovery phase through a compulsory Year 1 module, regardless of the disciplines they choose to specialize in. The purpose is to allow students to truly appreciate how relevant I&E is in every station of their future careers. It is also to imbue in them the awareness of fundamental innovative tools and scaffolds. Next, students can join us in the develop phase and take up I&E deepening programs in their remaining 2 years with us. So normally they spend 3 years in total with us. However, our relationship with our students doesn't end there when they receive their diploma. We have invested resources to support our graduates too. This is in the form of the Pinnacle Tier program, where we support an ever-increasing pool of graduates who wish to boldly dive into great uncertainty as they venture with their own startup. Here, I would like to emphasize that our focus is not to create as many successful companies, but to groom the individual. Thus, should a startup fail to gain traction or go the distance, but yet the individual grew from the experience and become a contributing member of society and a productive employee in a company, it is still very much a win for us. Next slide, please. In the discovery phase, students read a compulsory subject entitled Innova, which is delivered primarily through a teams-based project. Students are given problem statements that stem from real industry issues. In fact, we curated these problem statements from recent final year projects that our senior students actually worked on with the industry. You may ask, these are first year students with no prior training in their discipline. So how would we ensure a quality output and solution for them, from them? In Innova, we are not focused, nor do we put much assessment emphasis on the final prototype. It is the process that we are more concerned about. We assess how the students go through the process of problem scoping, researching, communicating, and negotiation, and allow their creativity to run wild on a clean slate. The reason we introduce industry problems is to let them know how relevant this skill set is. That it's not just a skill set for those who wish to enter into the research industry or just to start a business, but something they will apply almost on a daily basis as they improve on their work system and processes in whichever station they find themselves in. Next slide, please. Following Innova, students have access to furthering R&E training. These trainings cover equipment tooling and prototyping skills such as 3D printing, microbit programming, laser cutting, and so on. It also covers more comprehensive ideation and problem-solving tools, and also Business 101. Every semester, students are given 2 weeks in which they will not have any scheduled lesson related to their discipline. These are white spaces that we can use for such training as mentioned earlier. We are also firm believer that innovation happens at the blurred boundaries of disciplines. To that, Temasek Poly has set up the Innovation Lab. Domain experts from various schools and centers form this multidisciplinary consultancy team. And this team are readily available and actively working with companies to bring forth synergistic solutions for them. This staff team forms the core solutioning engine, and students from all schools will be intimately involved to work with these lecturers while working to solve the industry challenge. This will help to expand their perspective and help them to expose them to their blind spot. Next slide, please. Our Tier 3 incubation program consists of 4 elements. The first element, we believe that students do not know what they do not know. And thus, instead of working on an ad hoc workshop model, we have meticulously crafted 2 structured training programs designed to be taken in stages. A 1-month-long innovation program followed by a 6-month-long startup program. This will require them to have discipline and commitment, a trait we value deeply and wish to build in our founders. This curriculum was developed painstakingly with long consultation with our established entrepreneurs, industries, experts, student alumni, and venture capitalists. The second key element is our mandatory and structured mentorship. Our participants will be appropriately matched at the get-go with mentors that they will meet up with periodically through the whole program, and sometimes even beyond. This builds accountability and momentum in our participants, and these mentors serve as our eyes and ears to raise red flags to our attention for quick and effective intervention. Thirdly, we also provide facility support such as makerspace and various schools facilities for prototyping and product development, and also co-working spaces and rooms equipped specifically for online meeting and presentation. We have also furbished F&B retail spaces for our students to have a go in the F&B trade. Fourthly, the reality is that financial support is a key enabler for founders to even start. In Singapore, the government is committed to provide a good ecosystem for startups to thrive, one of which is the availability of monies to help founders initiate their business. Temasek Poly actively scans for these governmental grants and offerings from VCs and also angel community. Once we equip our founders with strong fundamentals and help them in the product development and market validation, we will facilitate in this fund application. Lastly, I would like to close by iterating our key principle. Whether you are running startup or solving 5 to 6 problems in your office, family, and even in the community, all this requires innovation, and this innovation is paramount. So as an education body for our future generation, TP's focus is squarely not on identifying the next blockbuster company, but on individual core skill development. In fact, we see all of our students as unicorns. And with that, I thank you for your attention and time.
Well, that's great. I think you can see why Bob mentioned that the Singapore system is one to be looked to and copied where possible, including the government funding that enables the students to move on with mentorship once they finish the program. That's wonderful. And you can now bring us into the American reality and let us know what your experiences have been both before moving to the community college in Northern Virginia as well as there. Thank you so much.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you. It's hard to back cleanup in this group, I will say. And many of the points that I wanted to share have already been made, so you'll hear echoes of them. But just really quickly, so I'm the president of Northern Virginia Community College. We have 6 campuses across the river from DC. We have about 72,000 students in credit programs and an additional 21,000 students who are in non-credit programs. The vast majority of them are in workforce certification programs that would lead largely to IT or healthcare certifications. And so the context that I bring from Nova is that we have long been an innovator in the workforce space. And prior to this, I was the president of Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York, one of the colleges that was part of Maria's study. And what we did there with connecting workforce programs to labor market information to ensure that they were demand driven and really led to sustainable wages is probably one of the reasons why I'm here today at Nova, but also the individual who ran that part of the college has been hired by the state of Virginia to look at the intersection of education and economics. So I think that this says a lot about where we are at this point in higher education in the US. And the community college is a uniquely US innovation really created to connect the full diversity of communities to the opportunities that higher education has to provide. But very much like Maria's story about the first grant that CCRC ever received, community colleges were largely based in the workforce needs of their region. So for example, the institution that I came from in Rochester, one of the reasons why it was started was because of the growing healthcare economy. And there was a recognition that there weren't enough access points to train the workforce that was needed for hospitals or for dentists or for anyone in that region. And so the community college got funding. So even in Virginia, one of the primary objectives for community colleges by statute is to provide the workforce for the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are the provider according to state law. And so that's something that I think we need to hold dear, because one of the challenges that I think Bob's data points to, that 1% that US was so negligible in that vocational or CTE training and education, is that over time there has grown a stigma about workforce education and career and technical education, right? It's seen as something less than. Like, why would you go into welding when you could go study philosophy? Well, I can think of some monetary reasons why that might be very appealing to you, but that whole discussion has really been foreclosed. And there is, unfortunately, a real body that's pushing the notion that 4-year is always better than 2-year. And in some cases, 2 years better than a 1-year certificate or a 6-month certificate, even though it really does depend upon the student which one of those options might be most appealing, might best fit their own inclination, or even the need for them to build financial or cultural capital. So I'll run through some quick lessons from institutions, having worked at 2 institutions that do this very well, that do foreground workforce and career and technical education. And so I'm going to go back to the notion of the guided pathway movement. And the things that the colleges that do this best do is they start with the end in mind. And the end is to find students employment, right? That these programs really do need to lead to sustaining wage employment within the region. right? Community college students don't pick up and move across the country to find work. 91% of our students at Nova come from our region. They're here. They want to stay here. And when they're in a workforce program, they want to find employment here. So we really need to be very sensitive to the workforce demands of our specific region. So a program that might make sense in upstate New York may not make sense here. So institutions need to be very locally focused. You also need to bring employers to the table to help design those programs, not simply as an advisory board, but they really need to be there from the beginning. So you also need to make sure that those are folks who hire your students, right? It's one thing for a company that only looks at baccalaureate prepared individuals to provide you with input. They're not really going to hire your students. You really need the employers who are going to hire your students. So just one quick example, when Amazon Web Services was looking to expand cloud computing and cyber, they sat down with Nova and we co-developed a curriculum that led to an apprenticeship program, the first of its kind with AWS. And if you think about scale, what Amazon Web Services then did was to take what it learned in working with Nova and picked it up and moved it across the country, right? They didn't reinvent the wheel over and over again. They saw what it took to build a very successful program that would provide a new on-ramp, both for our students to economic and social mobility, but obviously for them to a workforce, and thought this worked, we're going to replicate that. So always think about that notion of scale. The other thing is you really want to look at your labor market information. Employers can be very enthusiastic about how many people they think they're going to hire or what growth is going to look like, but you always sort of come back to the data. So looking at that labor market information on a number of levels. One is to look to see what seems to be growing, what seems to be shrinking, right? Those trends are very important. The other is to look at what skill sets, to Maria's point, seem to be common across a number of these different professions so that you can be training generalists who can move with the market as the market changes. Recognizing that a lot of the skills that employers want to provide are proprietary. So company X isn't going to share what they're going to do with company Y, but if they can get a really soundly trained, for example, mechatronics technician, they can provide the very special skill sets that they need on top of that. So it's one of the things that community colleges who do this best do, is to really do that skill scraping, to look for those commonalities and to build the programs that do the best for their students, but also serve the regional economy. You also need to look at wage data, not just national data or even regional data, but work with your Department of Labor at the state level if you don't have this information already, but to see what your students are really earning for what they learned. There are lots of data sets out there, but if that doesn't reflect the boots on the ground reality of your students, then that may not be where they end up going. And then you want to sit down in some cases and have discussions with employers, right? You say you're having difficulty finding a workforce, but you're asking students to engage in 2 years worth of education and you're paying them this much above minimum wage. You got to be honest with them. You're never going to find a workforce. And so something in this equation needs to change. Either you need to change what you're asking for on the input side. Is this really requiring 2 years? Could it be 6 months? Or you need to change the wage. And I think in the US right now, honestly, you're starting to see that discussion happen more frequently. And then I would say we need to make the lines blurrier. I think Bob talked about really blurring that line between community college and high school, that 12th grade sort of, this is one system, now we're entering a completely different one, is left over from another era, right? The more that we can push career and technical education down from the community college into the high schools is really critical. So Nova does a good job of that. We have more than 15,000 students right now in high school dual enrollment. Some of that is transfer education, looking to 4 years. Some of it, and a growing amount of it, is around IT fields, which is the fastest growing industry in our region. About 3/4 of all the world's data comes through Northern Virginia. So we've been working very closely with those providers and with data center operators. So you also need then to prepare students for a lifetime of upskilling, right? We just partnered with Amazon and with the data center group and with a provider from North Carolina around a very specific skill set, fusion splicing, that lets you repair a fiber optics cable and the data can still flow while you're doing it. That's not a skill that even existed like 6 months ago, a year ago. Now it's really required. So even folks who have those degrees are going to need to come back. So another lesson is that cycle continues, right? Always innovating, always upskilling to keep folks fresh. And then just a few more points about knowing your students, right? It really is important to understand the students that you're serving. I think we saw that with Temasek, right? What skill sets are students already bringing? What could we credential in advance? How could we use credit for prior learning to really advance students and accelerate them? Not pretending that everyone is a blank slate. Folks bring a whole set of skills to us that we need to do a much better job, all of us, even the top performers, in giving them credit for and credentials for. We also need to look at how can we fund what we're doing, right? So in Virginia, we're very lucky. We have a program called Fast Forward, which funds non-credit education to help students get credentials that have regional marketplace value. And that program's been incredibly impactful. We can show the return on investment for the state so that they'll invest more money. On average, students' income, their real wages have gone up 24%. For lowest income students, they've gone up 28%. So overall, that program's been successful. You need to have that data to show that. Based on that data, the state now has launched a new program, G3, which funds career pathway programs, both credit and non-credit, with tuition dollars for students so that these programs are more accessible than ever before. Why would Virginia do this? Because they need the talent pool. So sort of going back to that state strategy about building a workforce pool to help recruit and retain businesses, that's another role that community colleges can serve. And then I would also talk about business partnerships, right? Apprenticeships. How can we look at models like the Swiss apprenticeship program and bring more of those non-traditional apprenticeships to the US? Innova has started that in the IT field where apprenticeships didn't used to exist. We've got a new partnership with AT&T, for example, around jobs that need clearances, security clearances. So how can we help more students enter into these fields where the workforce, the funnel isn't this big, it's this big. And those programs help students earn while they learn. So it does attract a non-traditional student base who might otherwise never engage with our institutions. We also now are having some initial conversations around apprenticeships in professional services, in financial services, even in research firms. So all of these really, I think part of it is being driven by the real labor shortage we're seeing right now in the States. But another part of it, I think, is a move towards a skills-based economy that's happening much more quickly than any of us could have anticipated. And then the last thing I'll mention, you mentioned our new strategic plan, Opportunity 2027 in the Commonwealth. So the Virginia Community College System has about 300,000 students. We have 23 colleges, and we have all committed ourselves to achieving equity in student outcomes. Part of that is disaggregating the data so that we can see if there are challenges in equity and access to some of these high demand fields that Maria was mentioning. The other thing is a real intentional focus on the future of work. How can we prepare our students for a changing and constantly changing economy, for the jobs where data and automation have really intersected and created a need for ever higher skill sets and eliminated some of those entry-level jobs that folks would have counted on in the past. So we're coming together around that goal, again, thinking about this as a state strategy around talent and workforce development. And so with that, I'll stop.
Well, this has been a very rich treasure trove of information and ideas here. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions and then open it up to the participants as well as some questions we've gotten in the chat box. my first question, I guess, is having had a career in the K-12 system, as we're looking at changes and improvements in the community college, as we're looking at connections they're making with employers, how do we bring that back to the secondary school so that our students are understanding well before they get to graduation from high school what the opportunities are? I know that there are many, many students who really don't want to go to college. Their parents are pushing them to college, but that's in part because they don't see other viable alternatives. So what can we do there? You want to start, Bob?
Come off mute here.
Yeah.
No, I think this is a really important point here. I'm going to talk about Boston for a minute, which is my home base here. I've worked a lot with the Boston schools 40 years ago. I'm now back with another project in Boston, trying to see what's changed and what we can build on. One interesting change that's happening in Boston is that our sort of neighborhood high schools are now all adding the middle grades. We're basically moving away from a middle school structure. For me, this is a big opportunity because career readiness, if you will, really needs to begin at least as early as the middle grades, we argue. And what you need is a kind of intentional plan that year by year exposes young people to the world of work and careers. And there are lots of kind of light touch ways that you can do this that really will engage employers. But ultimately, our goal, this plan I'm working on with a bunch of others, is to basically create a goal that says, by the end of the 2024 school year, we want every young person in Boston to have had two kinds of opportunities. One, the opportunity to get started on college through dual enrollment or the kind of early college model. And the second one, which really speaks to this last point you raised, Susan, is that every young person gets enough systematic exposure to the world of work, including, and this gets to Anne's point, paid work experience. And that for high school kids, that's mostly in the summer. Boston happens to have a really strong employer-facing intermediary that's been doing this work for 30 years. So right now, roughly half of Boston kids get a private sector work experience, by the time they leave high school. Our goal is to scale that to make it universal. But the big point here is that, as you say, is to high school, often our high school kids and parents behave as if college is the destination, not college as a means to a career. And I wrote a little piece for a school administrators magazine saying, college is the means, career is the end. And if we could get that idea kind of established in people's heads, then you can begin, then you can start to address this question. Because again, Anne made the point, by the time kids leave high school, they should know enough and have had enough exposure to the world of work to make an informed choice about what comes next, what pathway, industry certification, 1-year certificate program, 2-year degree program, 4-year degree program, apprenticeship. They ought to understand there's a range of options. They ought to understand costs and benefits. They also certainly should understand that if they pick the community college route and they get themselves a certificate or a degree with value in the labor market, and they move into a firm, in all likelihood, they can then get support, subsidy from the firm to go on and complete a 4-year degree if that's what they decide they want to do. And our experience has been once kids get inside big companies, they realize pretty quickly that their opportunities will expand as they get more education. Last point here is that what we really need to establish, and this is one of the reasons we're trying to align work experience with college, is work and learning together are going to be the nature of what adult life is going to be in this country. I mean, again, Anne made the point. I mean, we're talking about students, pretty quickly moving into jobs that haven't been created yet. And so that, if you can get that idea established as early as high school, carry it forward in college, that work and learning need to be two parts of the same thing, if you will, I think we can make a big dent in this problem. But I don't mean to underestimate what a challenge it is, but our notion is this has to start in high schools.
Right.
Just to maybe be a bit provocative, I think the other side of this conversation has to be tracking, right? And tracking has been a part of our education system since its existence, right? Our K through 12 system was built to stratify, right? Some believe, and reproduce social inequities. And I think we see that even in our 2- and 4-year system as well. And so I think that question of, are we inadvertently tracking students into low-end jobs and careers also has to be part of the question and the conversation. And who ends up, and to Anne's point about disaggregating the data, that is absolutely critical. I don't think we can have this conversation until we know who is going into what programs, who is being disproportionately impacted. And we know by and large that minoritized students are the ones that often end up in these 6-month certificate programs where, white students continue to, move into the longer term career pathways. And so I think if we're going to have this conversation and really think strategically and systematically going all the way back to middle school, we also need to think about what those unintended consequences or perhaps intended consequences are. And even starting to the first point made about backward mapping, backward planning at the employer level. Who are employers hiring, right? We heard consistently across every college that there is just still continues to be blatant racism in terms of who employers are hiring and not hiring. And part of that is attached to the stigma of the community college degree and these workforce certificates and programs. So I think that part of this conversation, there needs to be some real honest reflection on who is going into what programs, what are the barriers then, if the case is that certain students are being disproportionately impacted and being tracked into programs, what are the barriers then to them going into the more higher wage career, family supporting pathways? So I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's something that colleges wrestle with. It's something we wrestle with as researchers, trying to understand what that means and what the solutions are, if you will. And certainly, in a place like Boston, the heart of racial segregation in its schools. I'm a product. I grew up in Dorchester and Lynn, so I experienced it and lived it. So I just wanted to put that out there and see if any of our people listening in have experience. Or Anne, I know you coming from Rochester, that was something you guys dealt with, and if you want to speak to it.
Sure. And just a couple things. One, I don't want to lose the point about the power of high school dual enrollment and the introduction of these pathways earlier and earlier. So we partner with Micron Technologies at Nova on a program called Systemic, which really does go all the way back to middle school and introduce students into sort of the world of STEM and in ways that is very appealing to younger people. We also provide enrichment activities that can be brought right into the classroom. So one of these things I think that sometimes is undersold is the way that community colleges can support high school faculty and middle school faculty, sometimes who are not always teaching within their subject matter expertise when they're talking about some of these fields. And in fact, Nova just got a grant from the state of Virginia to provide some career and technical education training for high school teachers so that they could teach IT subject matters under dual enrollment. But to Maria's point, there was a great report from Brookings that came out in March that looks at the disproportionality in large and medium-sized metros in the US between the percentage of their workforce that might be Black or Hispanic Latinx and their representation in math and computing related positions or their representation in managerial positions. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of our institutions to look at that data. And if we're seeing that we are not seeing a representation by Hispanic students or Latinx students or Black students or African American, how can we work inside our institutions, but even more importantly with external partners whose subject matter expertise is there to help our students succeed? So you mentioned Europe at the top. Nova is the largest home for Europe right now. We're also in discussions with CASA about how we can help students who begin workforce education with CASA, which serves the Latinx Hispanic audience, then to migrate into Nova. But also I want to go back to my other point. to give them credit for the instruction that they've received previously. Right? Too often, if we tell students, okay, now you're at ground zero again, we're just going to lose them because they can't afford that. It's not just money, it's also time. So we need to remember that.
I'd like to respond to Maria's point too, because obviously it's critically important. So two things, at least the way we've addressed that in the Pathways Network, and this actually comes back to Anne's point about the, as we say in the US, vocational education is a great thing for other people's children. And we've always had this kind of second-class thing. So we've addressed this by two ways. One is by focusing, not on the traditional trades and crafts that most people think of when they think of voc, but everywhere we work, it's IT, it's healthcare, it's advanced manufacturing, depending on the region, maybe transportation and logistics, maybe ag, programs that require college. The second is obviously to say all programs require a post-secondary credential. But I then come back to my one slide and the really disheartening notion that for kids from low wealth families, when you look at that data and you say, if we've only made a move from 11.3 to 11.8% of kids from the bottom 40% attaining a 4-year degree, we've got to have an alternative strategy. And yes, you can argue, well, community colleges are second best. I certainly don't accept that, and I know Anne and you don't accept that either. But I think we've just got to find a way to legitimize the notion that this is a perfectly, particularly, again, for an international audience, what they may not understand is that even though community colleges are relatively low cost, they still have costs attached to them, and that if you're in the bottom 40% of the wealth distribution in the U.S., that means you likely have a savings account of no more than $400. And given the fact that we now measure 4-year completion in 6 years, question is, again, if you're the first in your family, to go to school, you're having to work while you go to school, you went to a lousy high school, so you're probably, spending your first year or two taking courses that don't carry college credit. There are a whole bunch of reasons that explain why low wealth kids from low wealth families have such weak attainment. It's not about them. It's about family circumstances and the nature of our higher ed system. So we've got to, my view is we can't simply allow people to behave as if the 4-year institution, that's the only goal and all kids need to be encouraged to do that. We've got to create a set of powerful alternative pathways. So that's what our work is about. And even if we are susceptible to the notion that somehow, we're expecting less of kids who come from low wealth families than we're expecting of kids that come from middle income families. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to address, the social and economic inequities. It can't be the education system alone that's charged with that responsibility.
And even where I know in New Jersey, they set up more high-tech vocational high schools. But when you look at who's there,
right,
it is almost 90% white. Yeah. And the comprehensive high schools are saying, we had no problem educating those students. What we needed you to do is provide opportunities for the students for whom we have no equipment, we have no real opportunity to enable them to move into these careers. So it is systemic, and it is something that we have to fight all the way along. Wallace, do you want to chime in here? I know you don't have that same problem. It's one of the things that Singapore prides itself on is greater equity.
Okay, so traditionally, and in the Singapore context, students, when they reach 16 years old, they normally get two paths. One is to continue a junior college, which is a preparatory training to go into the university. And the other path would be vocational training, such as the polytechnic, whereby we're preparing them for the workforce. And traditionally speaking, there's always a stigma that the better students should go towards the junior college and then to the university. But what we notice as the year progresses, especially now, we noticed that a lot of students actually prefer the polytechnic route simply because they got a hands-on experience with the industry. We have come up with a very robust curriculum whereby there's a lot of industry connection during the 3 years in the polytechnic scene. And there are various touch points. We have career advisement and lots of touch points with the industry on learning journeys. And as in fact, even in the first year of the diploma, there are already attachment opportunities with the industry. So the students get to get a glimpse. And the second thing that I wanted to also mention is that why we begin to see this change is we have tried to deliberately set the mindset of our students and our parents that there's multiple pathways to achieve a person's aspiration and goal. In fact, some people will go through the diploma. If they do well, or they can then proceed on to the university, or they can actually go into the industry and then further on either do a post-diploma in the polytechnics, which we do offer, and we do see master students or university graduate students taking this courses. So it's just multiple pathways to achieve a certain aspiration. So once we manage to change the paradigm shift in the students, I think it will get easier as what we are beginning to see in Singapore. Hope that helps.
Yeah. As you say, we just have to start much earlier and ensure that our young students learn about these opportunities rather than waiting until they move to the community college. I think that there are lots of programs that can both help and hinder. I know that there's a great move toward making community college free and to students, no tuition. And I think that can be great for some students, but unless we have really started with the middle school student on up to understand what the future opportunities are, for many students, they just say, oh, well, I don't have to worry about high school. I'll just go on to the community college and I'll take the non-credit bearing courses there to develop the skills I didn't develop in high school. But we really have to change the whole paradigm of our secondary school system to focus on a real competency-based approach so that students understand why their skills and habits of mind, knowledge are critical to their future success. And we haven't done that yet. But I think that, I don't know, Anne, when you're working with local high schools, are you seeing that there is a greater focus for them on equitable opportunities for coursework, for career and technical education?
Sure, absolutely. But I want to go back to where Bob started by talking about how we have these really distinct systems. They're distinct in the way they're funded, they're distinct in the way they're organized. And I will say, having worked in community colleges for now close to 30 years, there is not always a lot of talk over that transom. And so, and when we look at the students, I never want to put blame on the students because students don't know what they don't know. Right. If someone gives you a high school diploma, you think you're ready to go out into the world. You think you're ready to start college because you've graduated. Same thing if someone gives you a bachelor's degree, you think you're ready to go to work, but we increasingly see employers tell us that may not be the case. So I think part of this then is really pushing to have conversations across those two sectors that also engage the business community, so that there is a broader understanding both on the parts of high schools and the parts of community colleges, what those skill sets are, what is that transition, what is the handoff, what are we looking for, what are you providing? But then also around all of that, it needs to be regional employers who are saying, what you're both doing is great, but here's the challenge. This is what we need. And too often that is not happening. And then I don't want to lose Wallace's point about their system, because one of the great things I think, and Bob has studied these systems much more than I, one of the great things, for example, about the Swiss apprenticeship system is the framework of permeability. right? So students can move into one part and then move into the next part. And they aren't punished, or there isn't a brick wall when they've elected A rather than B. And so B is never available to them anymore. So I hope you made a good choice. And that's the tracking that Maria was talking about. We need to be much more focused on how we help folks move through the system like this, because you don't get a degree anymore and you're done. Right? That was the framework that I went to college in. It doesn't exist anymore. You're constantly having to upskill if you want to maintain your own market value, but too often our systems don't reflect that.
As you could, tell from Wallace's presentation, and from what I know about the Swiss system, they both focus much more on these kind of core underlying skills, whatever term you want to use to describe them, whether they're professional skills, but the kinds of skills that will enable you to move as the economy moves. One of the things that we've always done when I've led, my wife and I have taken Americans to look at the Swiss system, we've always had a dinner with Swiss 25-year-olds who are typically 2 or 3 years out from the system. And what's always striking is that at least half of them have moved to a different field. They haven't simply shifted companies, but because, and this comes back to a point, I think, and you made the point about the contrast with the German system. The German labor market is much, the US, let me put it this way, the Swiss system, labor market is much less regulated than the German one. It's much more like the US system. So it's designed to enable young people to kind of move around a bit, but to give them a strong enough underpinning of skills so they can confidently do that. But the other point, this comes back to again, Anne's point. I don't know whether, Anne, you've seen this recent report that my wife and others have done from JFF called The Big Blur. It's basically an attempt to get people to now start to realize, look, we need to think differently about grades 11 through 14. We need to build some new strategies, maybe some new structures that get people to see this has to be much more continuous. And this grows out of our frustration over a decade's work, in the Pathways Network of trying at the regional level to, people just get enormously stuck in this process of trying to negotiate between these two systems. And we need a different strategy.
Yeah. Maria, you had looked like you wanted to jump in there. Did you?
No, these are great points. I mean, my head is always thinking like, what's, I know, I really appreciate the point about just moving, the flexibility. And I think that, to Anne's point around tracking, right? If we have a more fluid system, maybe we don't then have to worry as much about tracking, right? If students aren't being penalized for choosing A instead of B, right? Because B still will remain an option for them. Maybe that's a way to move past this real tension around tracking that is very palpable when you go out to colleges and you talk to students and you talk to people in the workforce space. So I really like that idea a lot, that concept.
Mm-hmm. In your research, did you talk with the community colleges about their interactions with the secondary programs? Is that
in some cases
that they focus on?
Yeah, and I think it is an increasing mechanism, if you will, for increasing diversity, creating a more diverse pipeline, reaching back into the college. Dual enrollment came up across many of the colleges we talked to. A lot of outreach into middle schools and high schools around STEM. One of the colleges we went to is a traditional manufacturing, a very high profile manufacturing training college in the country, and that is something that they're starting to do more and more is reach into the middle schools and high schools and try to get students interested in the STEM programs, in the manufacturing programs, and targeting minoritized communities within the area to try to increase the diversity. So those are approaches that we heard across the colleges we met with.
Yeah, I think that the notion of dual enrollment is a critical one for us to consider, so that students start earlier. But I think Bob made a point earlier about middle school, and I think that unless we move into middle schools, and parents of middle schoolers, as well as teachers and students in middle school, we're not going to solve this problem of college for all. I tried when we did the high school initiative at the department, gosh, now 18 years ago, to say, no, post-secondary is the word, but not necessarily four-year college. And I think, Korn Ferry just did a new analysis and indicated that by 2030, there will be an 85 million talent deficit across the world. And in the United States, it will cost us 1.75 trillion in unearned revenue that could have been if we had trained these young people. Worldwide, they're saying it's over $8 trillion of loss of unrealized annual revenue. So clearly, this is the issue that employers are focusing on. It's the issue that our government is starting to look at through Build Back Better, and hopefully something will come forward there. But I think it's going to be incumbent on states, as Anne mentioned, like Virginia, that recognize and put this into place.
I would just like to say, I mean, for all the challenges and problems we've been flagging, I think this is an incredible moment of opportunity. I mean, I think there's just lots of things moving in our direction here. There are these skill shortages. Workers are now standing up and saying, I'm not going back to my bad old job, and I would much rather use this opportunity to get myself enough skills to shift to another field. I think, again, Anne referenced when you get big companies like IBM saying, we're no longer going to require a four-year degree for jobs that don't really require a four-year degree. We're going to move much more towards skill-based hiring. That this is a growing movement. I think this really benefits community colleges if they can, take advantage of the movement. I do think that, there's just a lot of things moving in this direction, but, there's a huge messaging and marketing challenge here. And again, this group I'm working with in Boston, I mean, that's at the top of our list. I mean, it's messaging and marketing to parents and young people about these opportunities that they're simply not aware of, both on the dual enrollment early college side, when we have, Greater Boston has this rich array of higher ed institutions. More institutions are offering dual enrollment options than young people are taking. So that's a marketing challenge. And so, but again, I remain, I wouldn't still be doing this work at my advanced age if I didn't think that this really is the time to really now kind of lean in, if you will, and say we can get some stuff done if we can really just take advantage of this moment, because it's not going to be there very long. I mean, particularly politically in the U.S., this is the time to get it done.
And I would just add on to that, when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, I mean, remember Bob's one slide that if a company puts a baccalaureate degree requirement on any position, they have immediately reduced the diversity of their potential talent pool, immeasurably. And so there is a growing recognition that what used to be just a placeholder has really pernicious consequences. And so looking at the skills that folks are bringing, then it starts to address some of the tracking concerns as well. Because what's most valuable, for example, when you look at Amazon HQ2 locating in Northern Virginia, all of the universities cannot meet their talent demands. It's simply that equation doesn't balance. And so they've recognized they need to look further afield. They need to start to look at skills-based hiring. They need to look at upskilling their own existing workforce to meet some of these demands, which is a really good thing. I think, there are a lot of forces, to Bob's point, that are conspiring to help businesses, small, medium, and large, begin to realize that there are different pathways into employment and to finding really valuable talent that does reflect the full diversity of the communities that they're in.
Yeah, perhaps if we could get school board meetings focused on this rather than critical race theory, we might make some progress on this, because clearly, unless we educate parents about these opportunities, we're not going to move forward. And there are so many skills areas beyond the high tech, the plumbing, the electrician fields where, talking with a young plumber that we've used, and I said, why aren't you talking to young people about this? Because he's earning over $100,000 a year. And he said, I tried to, but they say it's dirty. They don't want to get dirty. So, we've got an image problem, certainly less so in the high-tech areas than in plumbing and electrical work. But I think that the message needs to be, if you want to move into the middle class, these are the pathways that will take you there.
One of the many lessons you can learn from Singapore invested a very substantial amount of money in a multi-year messaging campaign, to parents around, particularly these institutes of, technical education, which were designed, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Singapore's a much more top-down, kind of system than we have, and they, but for what they thought, their bottom 25%, they invested first in building these incredible mega centers for the 3 of them. And they look like very high-end university campuses. And so message 1 is, we need every kid to participate. And for the kids who are furthest behind academically, if you will, we really want to show publicly to them and their families, we're making a huge investment. And these are unbelievable facilities, I have to say. And those kids get, international travel, their arts and music, there's a lot, this is not just, get a technical skill and you'll be great in the world. They're exposing them to, a much wider set of experiences. But then they really invested very heavily in a messaging campaign to families about, why these schools were so important, why Singaporeans really needed to pay attention. We've never done that, never.
And I know that one of the traditional roles of community colleges has been to train, retrain people who are working at a company as the company implements a new technology or a new area. Are you seeing that these programs are helping to do your programs for the first time through students as well? Or is it a challenge for the community college to try and offer both kinds at the same time?
No, I don't think, well, for an institution like Nova, for MCC where I was before, no, I think, part of this is also scale, right? I mean, one of the challenges for community colleges is that, even in the Commonwealth, we have community colleges that have a few hundred students, and then we've got over 90,000 students. So some of these programs, it's easier to offer for larger institutions, but I want to go back to that notion then of a statewide framework or of a national framework, because part of the benefit of working, for example, as part of the system in the Virginia Community College system is we can share curriculum across institutions. So that's really important. In New York State, with the federal tax grants, the trade adjustment, completion grants, the community college system within the State University of New York developed an advanced manufacturing curriculum that had several subspecialties that was shared across the system. So I do think, that imagining these resources at scale and how that that provision can help address some of the bandwidth issues for smaller institutions is going to be really important. Because again, I go back to the notion that all of this is local. Community colleges are by design local institutions. We're the community's college. And so the workforce needs that we have in Northern Virginia aren't necessarily going to be reflected at Mountain Empire Community College in a different part of the state, but they still have a need to train their workforce and to provide folks there with the opportunity for upskilling. So I do think imagining some of these resources at scale that can be shared very widely is powerful. The federal government has made investments in that, but unfortunately that investment hasn't happened for a while now.
Right. Well, go ahead, Wallace.
So to follow up on Bob's and Anne's point, Actually, we did spend 2 to 3 years worth of time to engage the stakeholders. And how we do that is we set up this skills framework. So these skills frameworks were created over, there were about 33 skills framework across various sectors. And we gathered the employers, the industry association, the unions together and set up the whole a repertoire of all the various types of skills and jobs that's required. So case in point, we for the chemical sector, we came up with six different areas of work in the chemical sector, and created about 50 over job roles. And each of the job roles, we came up with the exact skills that the employers are looking out for. And this is a common set of language that can be taught across to the students, to the employers, to the unions, and even to the parents. And we also try to get the industry to have a commitment that we'll just hire based on the skills. And in fact, even in the skills framework, we also show where you can obtain these skills from, which are the institution, where it may be polytechnic or university, where you can obtain these skills, and therefore it allows this permeation. It allows that you can go by various pathways. As long as you acquire the skills, there will be a job waiting for you by the employers. So it took us a long time, like what Bob said. It's a huge marketing campaign.
Right, and something that we need to do. So a challenge for the next assistant secretary for they don't call it vocational adult education anymore. They call it career and technical education. We tried to get that change in place. But thank you all. This has been wonderful. Our next one is going to focus on what other countries and continents are doing. So we'll have Africa as well as Asia. And Wallace, we're going to get one of the ITEs on board for that too, so that they can participate on January 19th. But thank you all so much. I think this has been a very rich conversation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.